This is a production of Cornell University.
What I'd like to do with my time here today is to talk about a survey that I and others have been very involved with over the last year, and to give you the survey results, and both are some very specific questions, and most of the information will be presented in charts on the very specific questions. And then we had some open-ended questions that also created and generated some very good information about what growers are thinking. And then before I finish up, Andy mentioned immigration reform. I want to put some of the things that we found in this survey in the context of immigration reform, because that is so much on the mind of growers today and has so much relevance to the future of labor-intensive agriculture like apple growing. Let me start by recognizing the co-authors of this study. First of all is Paul Baker. Paul is the executive director of the New York State Horticultural Society. Paul actually came to me and asked if we could do this survey, and he said that he would help get the survey out and get the responses back, which he did. Allison DeMarie retired over the last year as a regional fruit specialist, but her background in fruit production and economics was very invaluable to this project. Nicole Ho was a grad student from the Dyson School who helped do data analysis. I took the leadership on writing the report, which will be out shortly. And Brad Rickard helped with the data analysis and the manuscript review and input on the report. So let me tell you about what we did, and let me first say that Paul Baker in the Hort Society spends a lot of his time working with the Labor Department and other government agencies, getting them to understand horticulture, and in this case, the apple industry. And one of his motivations was that if he has specific information about what goes on in the orchard, he can help inform the process of regulating through Labor Department and other agencies. The motivation for us in Extension is to have a data set and be able to say something more about the industry and about workforce issues in the apple industry than what our government data sets give us today. Yes, we get labor information from the census, and we get some from the New York Ag Statistics, and there is something called the Agricultural Workers Survey out of Washington, but none of those give us the detail that we can get when we do a survey such as this. So Paul, through the Hort Society, took the initiative to mail out 480 surveys to apple growers who contribute to the New York State apple order for promotion. We asked, it was a 3-page survey, we asked the growers to report their information based on the 2013 growing season. We got 95 usable responses back, about 20% response rate. We were fairly pleased with that. And one of the things that I want to point out right up front, especially with so many grad students in the audience, is that this is not a random sample. This is 95 growers who self-selected to return our survey form. And as a result, we have to be careful about expanding to the entire industry, because I'll give you one example here at the bottom of the slide. It just so happens that many of the people who decided to send this back happen to be growers who use the H2A program, about half of them. So this is not a random sample, but nonetheless, we have more detailed information about what's going on New York apple farms than is available elsewhere. So the number of bearing acres per farm, this slide gives you a sense that we did get responses from every size group. 19% were greater than 250 acres, 19% were also less than 20 acres, and then distributed in between that as well. But no one group is far larger than the other in terms of size based on acres in the survey. We asked for their 3-year average annual apple production, and specifically asked for the 3-year average because there was a very poor year with frost damage and cold damage to the crop that really reduced some people's yield a couple of years ago. So that's why we asked for the 3-year average, and you can see how that distributes as well. And then we asked for the total number of workers, and not surprisingly, the workers, you can see very visually there that the workers are concentrated in the top 2 size groups, 100 to 250 acres and over 250 acres. And then we asked each grower what region that they produced in. And so there are far more charts that will be in the report than I'm able to provide here today. But we were able to cross-tab between regions and get some interesting information. And so there are basically 4 apple growing regions in the state: central and western New York, northern New York, eastern New York, and Long Island. Long Island is not a very big player in all this, although Long Island is a very horticultural spot for New York State. There aren't all that many apples grown on Long Island, but this gives you a sense of how much response we got from all over the state. We only got 5 responses from northern New York, but you can see that that's the Lake Champlain region. There are very few farms up there, but they account for a lot of the apple production. Apple farms hiring H2A workers, and so I alluded to this earlier. 48% said we hire on our farm H2A workers. The other 52% said that they didn't. Now, one of the reasons why this is important is that in that 52%, very likely there are some growers who have some undocumented workers who are working on their farm. Anecdotally, what I find from talking to growers is even if you are in the H2A program and hire some H2A workers, you might also have some non-H2A workers that are undocumented workers. And so many people have looked at and discussed the fact that even though we don't have specific numbers, undocumented workers are not only a part of labor-intensive all kinds of labor-intensive agriculture, but they're a part likely of the New York apple industry as well. For those of you who may not be familiar with the H2A program, let me just make a couple of comments about that. The H-2A program is a federal government-run program operated through the Labor Department that brings in seasonal agricultural workers for commercial farms in this country. They can come here for up to 10 months, and then they go home. This time of year, growers are filling out their work orders and planning ahead to get their workers for the coming growing season. The home country of H-2A workers, primarily in this state, most of the workers are coming from Mexico and or possibly other Central American countries. Some are coming from there, but most of them are coming from Jamaica. And I will just go into more detail in a few minutes, but the H-2A program is very controversial. It's expensive, and there's a lot of paperwork and red tape involved in using the program. So sometimes it's criticized. On the other hand, if we look at the Lake Champlain area and other areas of the state where Jamaican workers come to work on apple farms, and we talk to the growers, we will find that many times the growers will say that these Jamaican workers have come here sometimes for decades, for 20, 30 years, the same workers coming back to work for 8 to 10 weeks. They're very productive, they're very reliable from the grower's perspective, and from the worker perspective, they can come for 8 weeks or 10 weeks and make a fair amount of income compared to their income potential at home, and then have a much better standard of living in their home country. The length of seasonal employment, this just tells you that for those growers that hire seasonal workers, 28% just hire harvest workers. The other 72% hire workers throughout the season for various production practices such as pruning and thinning and other operations. Using a crew leader, 26% said that they did use a hired crew leader, and Allison DeMarie tells me that this number has slowly decreased over the years and continues to decrease. Worker experience requirements. Now I want to go back to Paul Baker and the Hort Society, because a few years ago with the H-2A program, one of the things that happened, and policies change and rules change based on political administrations. And for some reason in the Labor Department, the Labor Department started to change their philosophy of what experience was needed for apple pickers and orchard workers, and consequently, a few farmers would put in their work order and find out that and ask for a lot of experience requirements, and the Labor Department said, well, you don't need all these work requirements, and so they ended up sending, in some cases, less experienced workers. And this created some concern in the grower community. And so the growers went to Paul Baker at the Hort Society and said, we need to document the kinds of experience that workers need, because these are not unskilled jobs. And so this next set of slides gives you some idea of the kinds of experience that growers feel that they need when they're hiring workers. So 35% said, no, we can deal with the workforce the way it is. We don't need previous experience. But 65% said, yes, we definitely need previous experience for what we're trying to accomplish in our orchard. Months of experience required by types of work. On the left-hand side, you get a sense of the kinds of experience that is needed: pruning, equipment operation, tractor driving, picking, for both fresh and for process. And then we have this whole list of specific work experience requirements, some of which growers, not all growers ask for this, but some growers do ask for all of these: pruning, chainsaw operation, etc., all these different kinds of experience they want the workers to have had for productivity reasons before they show up on the job. Then there's a picking requirement. People want workers that can pick quickly and without bruising. And so there's there's two components to that requirement. One is to be very productive and pick quickly and also not bruise the fruit. And so the average hours that we found workers were working for picking was 8.6, and they were doing all of these. They might be asked to pick drop apples. They might be asked to do fresh stem clipping, spot picking, cleaning the whole tree, and then picking for process apples. And the requirements on how fast they do that depend upon how difficult or easy the job is to do. Now, many of you may be familiar with this, but I learned a few things as an ag economist doing this project. And one of the things I learned was about fresh stem clipping. And if you don't know what that is, very often you have a thin-skinned apple-like Honeycrisp. And if you leave the stem on the apple and that apple gets in a bin with other Honeycrisp apples, the stem is going to pierce the skin of the other apples. And so the worker, the picker, is given a little set of clippers that look like small scissors, and that is used to do the picking. So now we've made this job of picking apples even more complex, because they have to clip the stem when they pick the apple instead of just pulling it off the tree. How apple pickers get paid. And we gave 4 choices for this. By the hour only, 26% said that's how they paid. Only by the piece, 14% said that. And then 27% said we have a combination of piece rates and hourly rates depending upon what we're doing and how easy or difficult it is to do the job. And that also goes to the last one. Depends means it depends upon how difficult it is to do the job. If a job gets difficult enough and you can't make your piece rate by doing that job, it makes more sense for a grower to use an hourly rate. And so we have all combinations of how pickers get paid. Wage rates. So this will give you an idea of wage rates for fresh apples, and this goes back to my comment about the random sample. If we had average wage rates for the entire industry, they would be a bit lower than what you see here. But when you have 48% of the growers in the survey as H2A growers, the H2A rate is, I'm not sure what it was for 2013, but it's around $11. It was around $11 per hour. So these rates are very likely higher than what would be the average for the entire industry. I think wage rates are really important, that we keep an eye on them and take a look at them, examine them. I'm going to talk about immigration reform in a minute. One of the big challenges that we have in agriculture is paying enough to compete with other employers in the geographic area that the business is in. And so keeping an eye on and making sure our wage rates are competitive is an important issue now, and I think it's going to become even more important in the future. And this just gives you an idea of what the piece rates are. Piece rates generally are by 20 bushel bin, and this gives you an indication of those as well. And as the job gets more difficult, we start with cleaning the entire tree is the easiest job, and so that rate's a little lower, and that goes all the way up to a much higher rate for fresh stem clipping when that is required in the orchard. Now, one of the opportunities we have, and this is a good example of the kinds of information that we cannot get from other government data sets, and that is we can ask in a survey like this, what are your worker shortage issues? Do you have worker shortage issues? And I don't have my slide, I don't have the slide here for the whole group, but what that slide says is that 36% of the growers said in the whole of all those who responded, 36% said that they were short of workers in 2013. And this gives you a bit of an idea of a breakout by region of who said they were short of workers and who said that they had sufficient workers. And Central New York and Northern New York indicated that they were most short of workers. Then we asked them, along these same lines, what was the average number of additional workers that you would have hired if they were available for your farm in 2013? And you can see that in some of the smaller farms it started out with 2 workers, and the very largest farms said they would have hired almost 11 workers, full-time equivalent-wise, to work on the farm if those workers were available. Then we went one step further and said, well, what do you, as you look at your workforce needs in the future, what are you anticipating? And how many employees do you think that you'll need 3 years from now? Fewer, less, or stays the same? And 74% said that they were anticipating with the needs of their business that they were going to need more employees than what they hire today. And this has real implications for immigration reform and how where these workers are going to come from in the future, and how we source labor in the future. And then finally, so the last thing that the grower got in the when he or she was filling out the survey was a couple of open-ended questions. And here's an opportunity for us to ask some things about, they can answer the question any way they want. Now, it gets a little bit, you have to then do this grouping, lumping process at the end, but we end up writing out all the answers on summary sheets, and it's very interesting to look at what growers say in an open-ended question when they can answer it any way they like. So we asked them first, what were the top 3 issues that you think grower organizations that work on your behalf should work on in the next 5 years? Labor availability and immigration and H2A and efficiency and all those things were far and away above the following 2. So labor availability was number 1. Not surprising, government regulation is number 2. We hear that all the time, especially as the farm grows in size. And then marketing, consumer education, global markets, buy local, all those marketing issues were number 3. So this is what they said they wanted organizations that they belong to do on their behalf in the years ahead. And this just is to reinforce the point that we hear this not only in the apple industry today, but many labor-intensive industries, that labor, workforce issues are our number one management issue. And if we could solve that, life would improve in terms of managing the farm business. Now, to me, this is the question that was most of interest to me when we put this together. One of the things that was on my mind a lot is, okay, we all know that immigration reform has stalled, but the farm manager is dynamic, operates a dynamic business, and does not stop just because immigration reform is stalled. They have to keep running this business because they have such a large capital investment in many cases. So we asked the survey participants, given the labor pressures that you've experienced in the last several years, including labor being short, how has or will your business change? And so these are in order of the response. Again, we grouped their open-ended responses, and in order of priority, this is what they said: orchard design, planting systems, and equipment to be more labor efficient was the biggest thing that they were doing. The other thing that goes, the second item that goes along with this, is downsizing, producing less, and decreasing acreage. And what that really means is with these high density planting systems that we have converted to in this state over the last 10 years with a vengeance, we are producing more apples on less acreage, or more apples, far more apples on the same acreage in some cases. The third thing that they said is we are relying more on H2A than we have in the past, which means two things. Sometimes the grower was not in the H2A program, but was going to go to the H2A program to hire workers, and others were hiring more workers through the H2A program. And then fourth, and this is not surprising either, it's gone on for decades, if a business becomes too labor intensive or too complex, there are certain people who say we just cannot come up with the capital, or we don't want to proceed with this business. The business is not viable for the next generation, and we're going to opt out. So some further comments on the open-ended questions. Growers are reporting a shift to high-density planting systems, higher yields per acre, platforms and other equipment dramatically improve labor efficiency. I took this photo at the Extension Fruit Tour up in Orleans County this summer. And this gives you a look at two things. One is the planting system is the tall spindle planting system, a high density system that has been developed and refined and promoted at Geneva. And the other thing is there you have in the middle of that row a platform, and that platform, the workers stand on the platform and can prune and can pick and do other operations that make the operations far more labor efficient than they ever were before. And so the one thing that is really interesting to me about all of this is that the high density planting system and labor efficiency were not developed independently. It was all developed together to be integrated. So all of these, the row spacings and the tying and all of these things were all put together in a way that labor could be the very most productive. So grower response to labor challenges make each full-time equivalent worker as productive as possible, and these new systems certainly do that. Eliminate excess labor and less productive acreage. I was I was in the orchard. I was up in western New York during apple harvest, and one of the things that's increasingly clear, land prices in western New York and around the state are going up dramatically. And so if you can be more productive on the same acreage or less acreage, then you don't have the extra capital investment of new acreage and new high-priced acreage. Reduce risk by using the H-2A program. And I haven't said anything about this yet, but in New York, immigration enforcement pressure has been dramatic. And the most likely reason appears to be our border with Canada and a high critical mass of enforcement officers in ICE and in Border Patrol out of Buffalo and in the North Country. And so there are several reasons why a grower would use the H-2A program. One is to make sure that they have the workers they need if there is a little bit of labor shortage out there. The other is to make sure that they don't have workers that are undocumented and could get deported in the middle or detained in the middle of the harvest season or the middle of the growing season. So reducing risk is becoming a more important part of the H-2A program and a motivation, especially in this state where we have so much enforcement pressure. I go to other states, I talk to folks from other states, and New York and Vermont seem to have a disproportionate share of enforcement pressure, and the growers feel that as they try to operate their businesses. And then the other thing that in their open-ended questions that the growers said is we're going to continue to aggressively advocate for immigration reform. I already made this point. Growers report an increasing reliance on H-2A because other workers are not available. They can manage risk, and it's a response to enforcement pressure. Now, the H-2A paradox, and I've sort of been leading up to this, growers who use the H-2A program are often very critical of the program. It's expensive, there's a lot of paperwork, occasionally you don't get your workers on time, and growers don't like that. They're in the program so that their labor needs will be predictable and the labor force will be predictable. And so there can be a few problems along the way. That said, some growers have reported in their open-ended question on this survey that without the H-2A program, they don't know what they'd do. Without the H-2A program, they would probably be out of business. And so, H-2A is, especially in this state, is becoming more important. So now that I've gone through some of the things we found, and there's a lot more information that will be in our publication that'll be posted on the Dyson website in the extension section. So now that we've gotten to this point, I want to put this in the context a little bit of immigration reform and what do some of these things mean to immigration reform. When we talk about what agriculture wants out of immigration reform policy, what agriculture wants is very clear. And the entity that speaks for agriculture in Washington is called the Agricultural Workforce Coalition. And it is a coalition of dozens of agricultural groups like American Farm Bureau, Western Growers, Western United Dairymen, and so on. All of the major farm organizations that deal with labor-intensive agriculture are part of this coalition. And the coalition speaks with one voice. And it says the following, and right before the last Congress, about almost 3 years ago, after the presidential election, they got together and redid this and reinforced their position, which is that agricultural operations must have access to a stable and skilled workforce, and we need to do this by doing two things. One is providing an adjustment in immigration status for the undocumented workers that are already working in agriculture so that they can stay and work in agriculture. And the other thing that is needed is to address workforce needs with a modern guest worker visa program. And what that means is if we continue with the H-2A program, it needs to be fixed. And if we don't, we need a new program that improves the good things, that improves upon the good things that we already have in the H-2A program. And one of the realities of policy in this country is that government policy is often based on inertia. And the likelihood that we are going to completely throw out the H-2A program and start over is pretty slim in my estimation, which means immigration reform needs to look at what's going right with the H-2A program, think about what needs to be improved, and then come up with a new guest worker program that will combine those two things. So that's what agriculture says it wants. So we just started the 114th Congress a few weeks ago. Let's look at what happened in the 113th Congress, the last Congress that ended on July 31st. The Senate in that Congress passed S-744, which was a comprehensive immigration reform bill. It had its own separate agricultural title, largely because that's what the Agricultural Workforce Coalition wanted. And in my opinion, agriculture could probably have not done much better. There was an opportunity for legalized status for the undocumented workers, and there was a new and improved guest worker program that would make some real changes to the H-2A program. So what happened? It then became the House of Representatives' turn to do something with this piece of legislation. Last year at this time, we knew that there was a window before the midterm elections, right up until about the August recess. There were some bills introduced. None of them one was introduced by the Democrats, and it looked just like S-744, and that was going nowhere. The other bills introduced by the Republicans failed to do anything about the 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. And at the end of the day, the August recess came, nothing was done, no bills were passed out of the House, and at that point, President Obama began threatening and saying, well, if you're not going to do, if the Congress isn't going to do anything, then I'm going to do something on my own, which he did. It probably only would affect what he did with his executive action, a small number of workers, to make them, allow them deferred status and deferred detention and deportation. So I don't see it as having a big impact on agriculture, and all the organizations that represent agriculture within 24 hours of the executive action being announced came out and said this is no substitute. Executive action is no substitute for comprehensive immigration reform, which we still want and are going to work hard to get. So that brings us to the new Congress, the 114th Congress. I had the opportunity to be with a group of farmers who were visiting House members on Capitol Hill 2 weeks ago, and it is increasingly apparent that, to me, that the House of Representatives cannot agree on what to do with the 11 million illegal immigrants, what immigration reform should look like. And it seems unlikely that anything is going to happen in the 114th Congress, because we have the presidential elections that will be in full swing by this summer, and when we have an election cycle, it's very hard to get these kinds of tough pieces of legislation passed. So it seems unlikely to me that we're going to have much progress, or any progress, in this Congress, which means we're probably going to have to wait until we get a new president and another new Congress, and hope at that time that we can get some movement. So, if you are an apple grower, if you're a farm manager, how do you think about all of this stuff that comes out of the survey and emanates from the immigration reform process? I think growers, there's no doubt that growers will continue to improve labor efficiency. These new systems have worked great, and they continue to take out the older varieties and the tall trees and put in these new dwarf trees and these new high-density systems. That is going to continue. They have said in their open-ended question answers that they're going to stay involved in the immigration reform legislative process, and I think that I think we have an environment now that if the organizations like Farm Bureau and others send out a letter that says it is time to call your congressman, this issue is so important that if there's a piece of legislation to support or to oppose, those offices will be flooded, because farmers are now paying a lot of attention to this. And then finally, develop a human resource strategic plan to include improved wages and benefits, improved housing, and supervisory training. One of the things that comes out of this discussion of immigration reform is, how do we keep the undocumented workers once they have a piece of paper that says that they have a legalized status? I think that one of the answers to that is going to be these 3 points: the wages, benefits, housing, and supervisory training. Now, with housing, apple growers have a leg up over, for example, dairy farmers, and we're a big dairy state. Well, apple growers, because of seasonal labor, already have housing inspections. Dairy farmers don't. And so dairy farmers are going to have, we still have to be vigilant in the fruit industry, but dairy farmers are going to have to have a whole new way of thinking about their housing and some of the regulations that may come about, because they're less regulated than the growers are at this point. At this point, I will stop there, and I think we stop at 1:10, so we've got time for some questions and comments and rebuttals and so on.
My name is the gentleman from the seat from back in the 50s. What we had to do at that time, those people who did not have farm experience before entering Cornell, we had to work on farms. Okay. What we did was a lot of things that are being done today that you showed in your slides. We had to pick the apples, thin them, and a lot of different things that way. I know farming has changed and Cornell has changed. Are we still doing anything here at Cornell to have some of our students work in the summers and do the growing process in let's say, upstate New York, Champlain Valley, etc.?
Not to my knowledge, but I might not be the best person to answer that question.
Well, there are a lot of internships available to students, and so those opportunities exist in the form of internships.
Okay.
Yeah, both
so
off campus here. I know, like the fruit group right here, Cornell has 5 every summer that they come and take them on, and they work on various aspects of growing fruit. Plantations has interns. Right. And, yeah, so I think there's also a formal course you can take on farm equipment and use. You sign up for like a regular course, and every week, you know, a couple of days a week, you go out and you learn how to drive tractors and hook up equipment and stuff like that.
Right.
You
Yes.
mentioned positions for people with the stem clipping for the. You mentioned the Honeycrisp apples.
Right.
What is in New York State? What is the economic? I mean, I know Honeycrisp is a relatively new and also very high value variety. What is what proportion of farms are growing like these high value varieties that would actually require that versus something like a Red Delicious or a Granny Smith?
We did not have enough information
Okay.
from the survey to answer that question, and I don't know the answer to that question. The newer varieties keep expanding, and the old varieties keep being replaced.
So farmers, as a whole, in general, tend to be conservative politically, and folks that are sort of pushing for, you know, slowing down, you know, no path to citizenship and no amnesty and all that are also politically conservative. So there must be some tension between those two groups. What's the nature of that conversation between the politically conservative politicians and politically conservative farmers? Is it different than what we hear as sort of the general public? And what's the farmer say to the politician who seems to be working against their interests in this particular case?
Well, that is a fascinating question. I can tell you what happened 2 weeks ago when we were on Capitol Hill. So I went with a group of growers, and we went to 5 or 6 House members' office, and usually end up talking to the staff. Now, some of those congressmen are new. And so then you have to start at the beginning and say why all this stuff is important. But some of them, like Tom Reed and others, have been around for a long time, Chris Collins, and they've heard this from the same growers for several years running. And so then you don't have to educate them. And so then it's likely that one of the growers will say, well, so tell us really what you think is going on. And one of the things we heard was, and this is a quote from one of the staff members, was there are 24 knuckleheads in Congress, in the House, that do not want to do anything with the 11 million undocumented immigrants. And so you have that small group that is very vocal and very dug in, and trying to find the middle for the Republicans has been very, very difficult. Does that help to answer the question? I mean, if you're Tom Reed or Chris Collins and you come from an upstate agricultural district, you get it. And you know that the farmers are not going to get off your back. So they're going to these conservatives and trying to get something going, and the conservatives are just staying dug in.
So to Marvin's question, the argument isn't ideological, it's between those in agriculture who want them to do something and the Republicans who can't do anything. So they end up explaining why it can't be done.
And we have to remember politically that those House members who are taking that hands-off, we don't want to do anything on immigration approach or anything for the illegal immigrants, they come from districts whose electorate want the same thing. So while Chris Collins's electorate wants this moving for agriculture, you've got another person, a conservative Republican in a conservative Republican district who wants the same thing that House member is saying. Geneva, do you have any questions?
I was wondering on that point 3 you have down there on that last slide, whether they're looking to current employers like McDonald's that trains a lot of people in supervisory training as a source of labor or crew chiefs or anything along those lines.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. would we stand to hire some workers away from McDonald's? Is that what you're saying?
Right, so that it's not immigrant labor. They're working at sort of similar wages, and they have some training.
I think that there is a difference between outdoor work and working in the elements and so on, and working at McDonald's. Number one. Number two, it gets back to this whole question of will Americans do these jobs? And I have a feeling that there are probably some McDonald's managers who wonder the same thing if Americans would do those jobs. So at these low labor levels, I think we're going to continue to struggle with how to get the workers and get them trained and compensate them to get the work done. I actually don't see much movement between a job like McDonald's and an apple orchard, but I do see both employers having the same challenges. Mark.
Just one thing, we always take it for granted that H-2A is an oppressive program, and you've explained the fact that it's difficult for employers. Why is it that way? Why isn't it built to provide that stable workforce that everybody wants?
I think a large part of the reason is that when laws like this are enacted, the labor advocates have had something to say about them. And so there are assurances put into the program. I think part of the paperwork is part of that. I think the wages are part of that. That the labor advocates have said the workers need more than what you're willing to give, and so they compromise on something that it does have higher wages and more restrictions along the way. Okay, I think we're done.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.